Hi, I'm Katie from the Michigan DNR Outdoor Adventure Center here in my backyard with this segment of Nature in Our Neighborhood. Today I'd like to talk about one of my favorite outdoor hobbies, birding. We will go over some basic bird identification skills and talk about how a hobby in birding can double as a really helpful community science project.
Some things that will help you get started are both the Merlin Bird ID app and the Audubon Bird Guide app. These are both free and will aid you in identifying birds. The eBird app, which is where you can enter a list of the birds you have observed as a community scientist, and if you wanted to, you could purchase your own physical field guide or an online version of a field guide, such as the Peterson Field Guide app, which will just provide more help with bird identification. Another thing that's helpful to have is binoculars, but they're not entirely necessary for starting this hobby.
So what do we mean by a hobby in birding doubling as a community science project? Well, through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, there are multiple opportunities for you to submit data in the form of a list of birds that you've observed to help scientists gather information. You can find all of the various community science projects at the link below.
How is community science helpful? Data helps scientists understand what is happening to bird populations and investigate questions like, how will the weather and climate change influence bird populations? How will the timing of birds' migrations compare with past years? How are bird diseases affecting birds in different regions? What kinds of differences in bird diversity are apparent in cities versus suburban, rural, and natural areas?
In order to make our list, we need to know how to identify birds first. Birding is a fun hobby that can also be challenging, but we have all the basic skills needed to identify birds. And birding can be whatever you want it to be, whether you travel around looking for birds or feed the neighborhood birds around you. We actually use bird ID skills all day, every day when we identify people, cars, food, and so on. One of the things we can use to identify birds is called field marks. Let's practice identifying an everyday item based on its field marks. Then we can talk more about what that means for birds. So we all know what this is, but let's talk about how we know. It has a long, narrow shape. It has a pink, rubbery end that's held on with this silver aluminum piece. It has a pointed tip with lead, and it's wooden. It also has this yellowish orange painted covering. We just used field marks to identify this as a pencil.
Let's look at the field marks on some illustrations of birds. What colors do you see on each of these birds, and where is the color located? Just like we described for our previous item. The first bird we have is a bald eagle. It has a dark brown body, a white head and white underneath its tail. It has a yellow beak and yellow feet. Our second bird is an American goldfinch, which has a yellow body, black wings with some white stripes on them, a black tail, and a black forehead. And lastly, our Canada goose has a lightish brown body with a tan chest, a black head and neck with a white strap on its chin, and it also has black feet. Color is just one of the many field marks we can use to identify birds. We can also use shape, size, behavior, and song. Let's talk about shape and size. We will revisit the birds whose colors we observed and look at their features in silhouettes. For the bald eagle, we'll notice that it has a large body, a hooked beak, sharp talons, a broader, shorter tail, and it's perched on a branch. Our American goldfinch is a smaller bird with a short, pointed beak, a longer, narrower tail, and it's also perched on a branch. And our Canada goose has a large body, a long neck, a rounder, longer bill, and webbed feet, and it is not perched. Let's talk about behavior. Here is an example of a description of an American robin from the Peterson Field Guide app. What behavior is described that we could use to identify this bird? Right here outlined in green. Often seen on lawns with an erect stance, giving short runs and then pauses. This is a pretty common bird. You've likely seen them around your neighborhood or backyard and might be familiar with this behavior described. Lots of birds have a noticeable behavior that can help us identify them from a distance. Sometimes we can identify a bird from its song without even seeing it. Birds all have different songs. It's how they communicate. Be sure to check out our Nature in Our Neighborhood Backyard Bird Song segment to learn more about some common bird songs with Natalie. One last thing I'd like to share that can be useful when identifying birds are range maps. Many birds migrate, meaning that they travel to different locations for part of the year. Range maps tell us what part of the world different species of birds are in during different parts of the year. Here are some examples of the range maps of the 3 bird species we talked about so far. You can see that all 3 of these bird species spend time in Michigan year-round, indicated by the purple color on the map. It is hard to tell on the bald eagle map unless you zoom in, but there is year-round purple coloring along the Detroit River. But what about birds who migrate completely away from Michigan for part of the year? Let's use the palm warbler, for example. Here is a range map like the ones we just saw. You can see that during migration, indicated by the yellow color, they pass through Michigan. Just this year, using community science data, some awesome animated range maps were developed that show a more exact window of what weeks of the year we can expect specific species of migratory birds. Let's check out a screen recording of the animated range map in action. You can see that they are all the way down in Florida and the Caribbean in January when the year begins. Now let's look at what happens when we play the map. By the end of April, they've arrived in the Lower Peninsula, and by the end of May, they've almost completely left Michigan for northern parts of Canada. And we can see that they make their way back through in a similar fashion during fall migration, passing through Michigan in September and October when they are returning to warmer climates for the winter. Okay, so now that we know all of that, let's get started looking for birds around us. Here's a snippet of what it looks like in my yard right now. I'm going to hang out here for a few minutes and see what comes by. Then we can see what it looks like to enter that information into eBird as a community scientist. When you're ready to begin a bird list that you'd like to submit as a community scientist, you can open your eBird app and start a new checklist. As you come across birds you're able to identify, you can search them and add the quantity that you see along your walk or while you're watching. I saw a mourning dove, a couple of European starlings, a couple of ring-billed gulls flying overhead, a couple of white-crowned sparrows, and quite a few house sparrows, 2 turkey vultures soaring in the sky, and an American robin. Once you're finished with your bird checklist, you can verify it and submit your data.
Thanks for joining me today in my backyard for some birding basics and to learn about why community science is so beneficial. This time of year, early May, is a great time to start a hobby in birding. We are at the peak of spring migration, so you might see some exciting new birds coming by that you haven't noticed before. I encourage you to download some of the free apps mentioned at the beginning of the video and participate in birding this weekend or throughout the rest of spring or summer in your backyard, neighborhood, or nearby park. Happy birding! See you next time!